Hey HTDA, and welcome back to my Satisfactory 1.0 Masterclass. In each episode I'll give you one specific goal to work towards that you should ideally be able to complete in 1 or 2 sessions. We now have the first item of phase 4 in production, and even though it doesn't feel like it, we're actually not that far off from completely automating everything else as well. However, in order to do that, there's one more basically work stream that we need to scale up, and that's the one relating to iron and steel production. In the last few episodes I already showed you the strength of using alternate recipes to not only simplify your factories but also really scale up the production you can get out of a few nodes, and this episode is actually going to take that to the extreme. We're going to be building a heavy modular frame factory with just a couple of iron, coal and limestone nodes, and actually it's going to be requiring a lot less resources than you might think. So honestly, you can pretty much do this anywhere on the map as long as you have a little bit of those 3 resources available to you. Now what I've done in this case, I actually figured I'd build a second factory close to the one we have over here, making the circuit boards and copper sheets, where again we were just using a single node, normal node of copper to make all of that. But actually this location is really nice because we have a nice little iron node over here. We have some coal. There's actually a couple of coal nodes behind this ridge over here as well. And we have a single limestone node over here to complement that as well. All 3 resources we need. It's not even pure nodes or anything like that. We don't need a massive quantity. And actually, if you check out the builder that I will be linking in the description, and you turn off all the alternate recipes, you can actually see the required resources shooting up massively. So this is really going to be a demonstration of how you can save on the resources while still actually making your factory a lot easier to build, and combining all of that to make a nice little production unit. Now, even though I would heavily recommend getting all of the alternates we're going to be using in this episode, and you can actually check out which ones those are by again looking at that planner, if you don't have some of them and you don't want to go around and find some more hard drives to unlock them, what you can actually do is just go to the planner, uncheck those, and you can automatically see what adaptations you will need to make to your factory accordingly. On a purely aesthetic note, because we have another factory close by, I've decided to make sure that the new factory is going to be on the same height as the other one, just to make things look nice and clean. Speaking of which, because there is these I don't know what to call these stone formations over here that we cannot remove, sad face, I'm going to have to be building around that. So this bridge is not actually going to be there in the final product, but I do need to make sure that I use this to kind of level my factory. And then I'm probably going to be building my factory starting from this location over here, so the arches don't get in the way. Arches, that was the word I was looking for. Alrighty, so to kick things off, we're going to need the equivalent of 9 refineries making iron ingots. Now, normally we would be making those in smelters, but as you can see from the recipe, normally you get a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 ore becomes 1 ingot, but by using the pure iron ingot alternate, we are actually turning 7 ore into 13 ingots, so that's almost twice as much from a single ore compared to the default recipe. So this is why we're going to be massively optimizing the throughput from this factory, because basically we're reducing everything we need by half, and that's just this first recipe. And speaking of making things twice as efficient, we're going to do the same thing with the concrete. So I have a single refinery over here, just one, making wet concrete. That's not called pure for whatever reason, but the principle is the same. We throw in some water and we get concrete out, and we're actually getting exactly twice the amount of concrete for every single ore we throw in here. 3 water pumps are going to be more than sufficient to make sure all the refineries are getting enough water, and you can just have a single pipeline supplying all of them. In terms of the actual nodes we're using this pure iron node over here that we're going to overclock slightly because we need about 305 iron ore per minute. You can overclock it to just 300 if you want to save a power shard, but you should have plenty of those by now. We're also going to need quite a bit of coal. We need about 520 per minute in total. We have 4 nodes, so there's 2 of them over here and there's 2 of them hiding in the back over there. You're going to need to overclock at least one of them to get to the required 520 coal per minute. And then we have the single limestone node over here that we just can use as is because we don't need to overclock that at all. The coal, along with most of the iron ingot production, is going to go into these 12 foundries over here. We actually need a total or equivalent of 13 foundries in order to make all the materials that we need. So you're going to need to overclock at least one of them to 100% or two of them to 50, whatever you want. So get the equivalent of 13 foundries in total making steel. Now we're going to be using the alternate here again. This is the solid steel ingot alternate that we've been using before as well in our previous steel factory, because that increases the output by 50% for all the materials going in. So you can see things stacking up like quite heavily here actually, because we've just doubled basically our iron ingot production, and now we're increasing the steel production by 50% as well by using an alternate. Now, you've heard me say in some of the previous episodes and also in the comments that I typically don't build more than what I actually plan on using short term. This build is going to be the exception, because it's so efficient and so easy to just make a whole lot of steel in this particular factory that we're actually going to be massively overproducing steel ingots. And I don't currently have a plan for using them in the next couple of episodes, but just set them up and make sure you have them available, because you're going to need plenty of steel in the future as well. And as you will see in this episode, you can use steel to make a massive amount of different things, so just having that available is going to be convenient later on. Next up on the list are 6 constructors making steel pipes. Now you could underclock these machines to get to 6 constructors making iron pipes, because well, you likely have a similar blueprint with at least 8 constructors in there. However, you could also decide not to underclock them and make some additional steel pipes, because like I just said, we do have an overproduction, a significant overproduction actually, of steel ingots, so you might as well put that to use and then either sink the remaining ones or export them to another place in your factory. Now I am using the default recipe over here mostly because it's a very straightforward, simple recipe, and I like using alternates to make things easier rather than more complicated. But if you want to use an alternate, then the alternate for molded pipes, using concrete and steel to make more pipes than you would normally get, is a very nice way to scale up the production for pipes as well. You could easily do that because we already have the concrete in production over here, so just overclock this miner a little bit and then overclock the refinery as well, or build a second one. But that's completely up to you. It's not really needed, and pipes are very straightforward to make and pretty efficient to make already, so I'm just sticking with the default recipe for now. We're going to need a whole lot of basics to add to our system, which means we need some iron plates, we need some screws, and we need some iron rods. Now, all of those could normally be made from iron, but you can also make them from steel, and because we have steel in production here anyway, that's just super convenient. So what we need is a total of 3 foundries making steel cast plates. This is the alternate recipe. Now, just checking that out for a moment, normally you get 2 plates out of 3 ingots, and now we get 3 plates out of 1 ingot. Of course, we do need to add in the steel, so it's not a completely fair comparison, but it's just a pretty efficient recipe just by adding in some steel to the mix. On the same note, we're going to need some steel beams and some iron rods, but the iron rods can also be made from steel, so we use the steel rod alternate. Specifically, we're going to need a total of 68 per minute, so I'm underclocking one machine because I have a second one, so by just typing in the number. But again, you don't need to underclock it if you just want to produce a little bit more, because we have plenty of steel ingots. Similarly, we need about 10 steel beams per minute, so I'm underclocking this machine like that as well. Then we're almost done with the steel production, I promise, but there's one more thing we need, and that is screws. And you might have noticed in one of the previous episodes when we built the other steel factory that I really like the steel screw alternate, mostly because we get a ton of screws by just using a tiny amount of steel, and we have plenty of that in this particular build. The nice thing about the screw recipe now at this point in the game is that we have belts that can easily handle a large amount of screws as well, so we only need a total of about 2 constructors making steel screws to have all the screws we need for this build. The only reason we're actually making iron plates in this specific build is to funnel them into a couple of assemblers making reinforced iron plate. Just like before, I'm using the bolted iron plate alternate, which is actually not really changing anything to the recipe other than making sure you get 3 times as much iron plates out of a single assembler. So this is mostly to reduce the amount of assemblers that we need rather than really changing the recipe. But we're going to need 23 of these per minute, so 23 reinforced iron plates per minute, so you could easily make that in a total of 2 assemblers. We're actually already getting pretty close to the end of this build because of all the streamlining we've been doing thanks to these alternate recipes. Now I'm actually going to stick with one of the default recipes for once, making the modular frames. Honestly, the alternate recipes you have available for modular frames are all pretty good. They all use different variations of plates, iron rods, and pipes. And honestly, like I said, all of them are pretty good. So if you do want to use some of these alternates, then you can. I just wanted to make this build as straightforward as I could, so this is why I'm using those. So remember, we need a total of 4 assemblers in making that particular recipe, but feel free to use some of the alternates here if you want. The next building is a little bit odd because we don't actually need it for the heavy modular frames, but we are going to be needing those elsewhere, and that is a single assembler making rotors. Just using the default recipe in this case, although you can definitely use some of the alternates as well, but most of those alternates actually use different materials that we don't have available in this particular build. Just a single assembler making rotors, and while you're at it, look at this, look at this. Doesn't it look pretty awesome looking at all these beams and power supply units working all together? It really looks like an integrated factory than just loose elements just stitched together. Anyway, we were building a factory TDA focus, and to continue the trend of making use of cost-efficient recipes, we are going to put the concrete to use as well as the steel pipe production and use the encased industrial pipe alternate to make the encased industrial beams. That's a lot of work. Anyway, the whole point of this is that this is actually replacing the steel beams that you normally need to produce these industrial beams by pipes. And since pipes are a lot cheaper to produce than the beams, this is going to save you a lot on the resources as well, while producing the same thing and also actually requiring pretty much the same type of inputs. We're going to need 2.5 assemblers making these industrial beams at least, but again, you can easily scale this up if you want to, just by increasing the pipe production as well as the concrete production that you have in this build anyway. And then last but not least, we need a single manufacturer making heavy modular frames, specifically using the alternate for this, the heavy encased frames. This again improves the efficiency of this particular recipe by a lot. It's actually requiring pretty much the same types of inputs, but you get a lot more bang for your buck, so to say. It's worth noting that the recipe is a little bit weird in terms of how much it produces, but we actually need 3 per minute, so I'm slightly overclocking this. And apologies to say this again, but if you want to scale up this production as well, you don't need to do so, but you can easily do so just by ramping up the production for everything else as well. All that is left at this point is just combining the different in and outputs together as required based on the recipes that you decided to use, and making sure the factory looks nice and clean as well, using some pillars and things like that to connect everything to the floor. Now, this episode is very much on the short side, and this is very intentional on my part, because this specific build to make modular frames is something that lends itself towards many different uses, so I thought it kind of deserved its own episode. We are not just producing the heavy modular frames here, but we're also producing the normal frames, where you're producing pipes, industrial beams, rotors, screws, plates, the normal plates I mean, and iron rods, and all of those combined are like half the amount of basic elements that you need to make all the more complicated stuff. So scaling up this build or replicating this build somewhere else on the map is a massively useful tool to have in your arsenal, or in your toolbox I should say, to pretty much make whatever you want throughout the entire game. Of course, it does heavily rely on using some of the alternates, but then again, you don't necessarily need to use all of them. Long story short, I do believe this is very much worth its own episode. Something else I want to note about this particular type of factory is that this whole thing is designed to produce a couple of things, but only in small quantities. We're producing something like 20 additional pipes per minute, we're producing 4 rotors and 3 heavy modular frames. None of that is really worth putting onto a train. I mean, you could, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it's not really designed around high outputs. Instead, what you could do is use some drones to get this transported to wherever it needs to go. All in all, I think drones are super fun to use, so that is exactly what we're going to be doing in the next episode. Speaking of the next episode, in that next episode we're going to pretty much be combining everything we've been doing so far over the last like 5 or 6 episodes and making some massive progress on the actual completion of phase 4. So if you're still here, first of all, you're awesome, but I also hope you're very much excited about that, so I definitely hope to catch you in the next one.